Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Neda Hussein, and I work here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition on our state and local innovation campaign. And today's webinar will focus on rent stabilization protections and provide an overview of state and local level tenant protections and two advocacy campaigns that led to rent stabilization protections, both at the state and local level. And next slide, please. All right, so we have a great lineup of presenters today. I'll start by talking about our work here at the Coalition, and then we'll learn more from the Community Service Society of New York about their research on rent stabilization protections. And then we'll hear from two advocacy campaigns, one in Oregon to enact rent stabilization protections, and the other in Prince George's County, Maryland. And then we'll save our Q&A till the very end, but please feel free at any point to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A box and we'll get to them. And if we don't get to them, we'll put our contact information in at the end so that you can reach out to us. All right, next slide, please, Tiara. All right. So before we get started, I would love to tell you more about our work here at the Coalition. As mentioned, I work on our state and local innovation campaign, and it is a fairly new campaign started by the Coalition. So historically, NLIHC has focused exclusively on federal level tenant protection work. But in April 2024, we launched our state and local innovation campaign to focus on supporting states and localities in keeping eviction rates down and preventing homelessness. And we recognize that in the absence of federal level tenant protections, that this work is critical. So we work on 4 key areas. The first is advancing, implementing, and enforcing state and local level tenant protections. The second is creating and sustaining permanent emergency rental assistance programs, which was a very large component of our work during the COVID-19 pandemic when we previously had our ERASE project. The third is preventing the criminalization of homelessness. And fourth, we provide technical assistance around state housing trust funds. Next slide, please. All right, so tracking tenant protections is a very large component of our work. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we started our state and local tenant protection database to provide tenants and housing advocates insight into what protections existed in conjunction with emergency rental assistance. But we decided to expand our database in May 2023 to include protections passed across all years and in all states and localities. In our database, which we will post a link to in the chat, we have tracked over 700 different protections passed at the state and local level. And since 2021 alone, we've tracked more than 400 state and local level tenant protections passed across a number of categories, including rent stabilization protections, just cause protections, right to counsel, and many, many more. Given that over 400 protections have been passed since 2021 alone, it's really a testament to the work of tenant advocates and the need and want to pass permanent protections to keep eviction rates down and protect tenants over the long term. Next slide, please. All right, in addition to our tracking, we also have a number of resources available on our website. The first, which we launched this year, is a state and local legislative tracker to provide information on protections that have been introduced. So in addition to tracking tenant protections, we also track preemption policies that have been introduced, criminalization bills, anti-squatter bills, and ERA as well. We also have a number of briefs and reports and fact sheets on our website related to tenant protections. For example, in 2023, we released a toolkit on eviction record sealing, and last fall, we released 4 toolkits, which I will talk about in just a minute. But Tori can provide the link to our state and local innovation site so that you can read our reports. And then third, which you all are joining today, is our webinar series on tenant protections to provide an overview of the types of protections that can be passed at the state and local level. So we have one more webinar series to take place on June 11th on laws that strengthen code enforcement procedures and habitability standards. And just a note, this webinar will last today until 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I believe it might have said 3 in the memo we sent out, but this webinar will last until 3:30 p.m. Next slide, please. All right, so I mentioned the toolkits, but in the fall of last year, we released 4 toolkits on state and local level tenant protections, one on just cause, which we had a webinar for in February, rent stabilization, code enforcement procedures and habitability standards, and then laws that limit excessive rental fees. Each of these toolkits provides an overview of each of the protections. We also talk about places that have these protections in place. We break out the core components of each of these protections, and then we offer recommendations from tenant advocates on how these protections can be strengthened. So next slide, please. All right, in addition to the rent stabilization toolkit we released a case study to go alongside it to highlight actual advocacy campaigns that led to the enactment of permanent rent stabilization protections. And you'll hear from the people we highlighted in our case study today. So we highlighted Oregon and then Prince George's County, Maryland. The case studies complemented the toolkits, which were more technical, by providing an overview of the challenges and successes that occurred during these legislative campaigns, as well as to highlight the impact of these protections, including how are they being enforced and implemented now. So next slide, please. All right, now to get into our rent stabilization webinar today and to provide an overview of what rent stabilization protections are. So rent stabilization protections fit under an umbrella of rental regulatory protections. So rent stabilization protections are a critical anti-displacement tool that limit the amount and or speed by which rents can increase over a certain amount of time. And this is typically in alignment with the tenant's lease agreement. Rent stabilization protections are critical because they offer tenants transparency in knowing by how much and when their rents will increase by. Next slide, please. So why are rent stabilization protections needed? Well, as rental rates across the country continue to increase, workers' wages have not met up with the pace at which rents have risen across the country, making housing incredibly unaffordable. At the same time, demand in the housing market has increased considerably. Based on our latest gap report, our country faces a shortage of 7.1 million affordable and available rental homes for tenants with extremely low incomes. Given that rents have increased and that there is a shortage of affordable and available housing, this means that tenants are overextending their budgets every month, leaving very little money left over to afford other basic necessities such as food, healthcare, and transportation. Next slide, please. In our toolkits, we broke out the core components of rent stabilization protections that have been passed across the country, and we identified 4 main components. The first being that rent stabilization protections place explicit limits on rental increases, usually focusing on the amount and or pace that rents can increase by. The second component that we identified is that these protections typically include requirements for notifying tenants about impending rental increases. The third are explicit explanations of the exemptions, and this includes the types of properties that are included under the law and the types of tenancies as well. And then fourth are the enforcement mechanisms, so how these protections are being implemented, and then any consequences for failing to comply with the law as well. And next slide, please. All right, so rent stabilization protections have been passed at the local level and at the state level as well. At the state level, Oregon, California, and the District of Columbia have such protections in place, and more than 40 localities have enacted rent stabilization measures. One thing I want to note is that preemptions often target rent control and rent stabilization policies from being passed, which offers a hurdle for tenants in passing these protections, or I should say housing advocates in passing these protections. In our tracker, we've identified a couple of states that have introduced legislation this year to either pass rent stabilization protections or repeal preemptions that exist around these protections. And next slide, please. All right. Before I end my presentation, I just want to say that our team at the coalition hosts every month on the fourth Thursday of the month an informal state and local tenant protections network for housing advocates to come together and talk about their work to advance tenant protections at the state and local level. I've included the QR code here if you'd like to sign up to join our network, and we can also post in the chat as well the direct sign up link. But that is a way to get involved in our work around tenant protections. And next slide, please. All right, and if you have any questions related to our work at the coalition or my presentation, please feel free to reach out to us, and we would love to hear from you. And that is all that I have, and I will pass it over to our next panelists, Oksana Miranova and Samuel Stein from the Community Service Society of New York, to talk about their work related to rent stabilization. So I will pass it over to you both, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nada. Thanks everybody for being here. We are Samuel Stein and Oksana Miranova from the Community Service Society of New York. Community Service Society has been around since 1843, doing advocacy for low-income people of New York, but especially for better housing conditions. CSS, as it's usually shortened, worked on the city's first tenement laws, worked on the country's first public housing, and has been organizing for stronger rent regulation for a very long time. This is a quick agenda of our portion. We're going to talk about who lives in rent-stabilized housing in New York City, the popularity of these programs, some research about the effects of rent stabilization on the broader housing market, the history of rent stabilization, its recent reforms and additions, and where the fight will go to next. Just as a basic thing, rent stabilization is in effect in New York State for New York City, 3 neighboring suburban counties, and the city of Kingston, New York, and a lot of other municipalities around New York State are now trying to opt into rent stabilization, and we'll talk about that fight later on. Covers almost 1 million apartments in New York City, comprising about half the private rental stock. As a general rule, it's apartments in buildings built before 1974 with more than 5 apartments in them where the rent didn't rise over a certain threshold at a certain time. It's a little complicated because that threshold changed over time. But basically most apartments that are older than 1974 in buildings with more than 5 units are covered. The median household income for rent-stabilized tenants is about $60,000 compared to $90,000 for market rate rentals. So although it's not a means-tested program and was never designed to be, it does serve a lower income population than the market rate of New York City. And there's a significantly higher proportion of Black, immigrant, senior, and disabled households in rent-stabilized housing than in market rate rentals. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here's a breakdown of New York City's low-income population and what kind of housing they live in. You see that rent-regulated housing is the largest chunk at 37% of low-income households. After that, we see unregulated rental housing, sometimes often in smaller buildings than are allowed to be in rent stabilization. Some are in owner-occupied housing. Public housing houses 11% of low-income New Yorkers, so less than a third of those housed in rent regulation. So this is really crucial to New York City as a whole, and especially to low-income New Yorkers. Next slide. Great. So here is a report we released just a couple months ago, and we will add links to all this in the chat later on. But this was asking households in parts of New York State that are not covered by either rent stabilization or good cause, whether they would support their municipality opting in. And we expected to see support for this, majority support. We did not expect to see quite as broad or deep a support as we found. So for rent stabilization, 81% of respondents said, yes, I want my locality to opt in. That was true in not just urban areas, but also rural and suburban parts of New York State. It was true across racial groups, with Black New Yorkers showing the largest support, but 81% of white New Yorkers supporting this as well. Across age groups, with the strongest support in the middle of the age groups, but really all over. And even across party affiliation, Democrat, Independent, and Republican showing supermajority support for adopting rent stabilization in their areas. For good cause, that's a newer law. So we just passed good cause in New York State last year. New York City was immediately brought in, but every other place had to opt in. And many have, but we did this survey in places that have not yet opted in. And the first finding was that most people didn't know what good cause is. It's new. The name maybe doesn't tell people what they need to know. But once we described how it works, we found almost exactly the same support for it as rent stabilization. 78% of respondents said that they wanted their municipality to opt into good cause, again, across geography, across urban, suburban, rural, across race, age, and party affiliation. So while not all of New York State currently has rent stabilization or good cause, there's a strong mandate from people in places not yet covered to opt in. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So we also put out a report called The Truth About Good Cause and Housing Supply, along with a couple other advocacy organizations during the fight for good cause in New York. And we wanted to look at common myths about the economic impacts of tenant protections, whether that's good cause or rent stabilization, on housing quality and on housing supply. We looked at a number of studies and found no clear connection between cities with strong tenant protections and cities experiencing disinvestment and landlord abandonment. We found this in newer studies, but this goes back historically as well. For example, in 1981, Peter Marcuse found that for every city with rent control that was having problems with disinvestment or landlord abandonment, 7 others without rent control had the exact same issue. And in New York City, the areas with the highest rates of landlord abandonment also had the lowest degrees of rent regulation. So there was no direct correlation between those two, between the laws and between those outcomes. Next slide, please. In terms of supply and construction, we looked across the Hudson River at New Jersey, which has had good cause for over 40 years and has some of the strongest rent control policies as well. Cities in Hudson County, New Jersey, like Jersey City and West New York, have both some of the strongest tenant protections, rent control, and good cause, and some of the fastest rates of housing production in the country. And the suburbs of those cities, all really city suburbs all around New Jersey, added housing at 3 times the rate of New York State's suburbs. So neither rent control nor good cause are inhibiting production in New Jersey. And it also hasn't led to a shift from developers building rental housing to developers building condominium housing, as some have claimed would be the outcome of regulating rents. Instead, we find just about the exact same proportion of rental and owner housing in 1974 when those laws went into effect and today. Next slide. Okay, great. So now we're going to transition into talking about the history of rent stabilization in New York State.
Hey everyone, thanks Sam. So I'm gonna take us back about 100 years and then bring us back into the present. Not only because history is informative, but also to normalize the idea of rent stabilization a bit. I know that we have a wide audience here from all across the country, and I do think it's important to, in our organizing and advocacy, to bring the idea that rent regulation has existed in the US for over 100 years, and that it's not necessarily a novel or a unique idea. So the first modern form of rent control in the US was established on a local level in 1920. Both DC and New York City established rent control at about the same time, mostly as a result of labor and tenant organizing in response to the upheaval in the rental market because of changed economic impacts of World War I on the US. And there was almost immediately a Supreme Court challenge to these rent control measures. A group of landlords sued DC and lost. So almost immediately in 1921, the Supreme Court ruled that rent regulation or the rent control was okay constitutionally. It was not invalid. New York's rent control stuck around for about 9 years. And then as the supply crunch after World War I slowed down, and as the first Red Scare, so the kind of political attack on labor and leftist organizing of all kinds suppressed the organizing that was happening. The combination of both of those factors allowed a more conservative legislature to come in and to phase out the rent control that existed. There was a little bit of a lull, and the second big moment for rent control in the US was during World War II. The federal government established something called the Office of Price Administration, again, reacting to economic upheaval because of a World War and because of the restructuring of industrial production all across the US and the way that the population moved in response to that. And basically, rents were frozen from 1942 to 1947 at 1942 rent levels. And again, kind of a similar pattern where after the war, there was a right turn politically, and most states first the federal government devolved the responsibility over rents to the states, and then most states got rid of their rent control pretty quickly, often painting it as a communist ploy. New York State and New York City were different. We got to keep our rent control until 1969, though it was weakened pretty significantly and then phased out in 1969. In the 1970s, there was again a revival of organizing for rent control, again coming out of big social movements, including the civil rights movement. And California, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, all passed new rent control measures. On the state level, they all looked really different. Some of them were a sort of statewide laws that enabled localities to opt in. Others were a little bit broader. And then there was individual cities, including New Orleans. So in kind of like more conservative parts of the country that tried to pass rent control and were basically beaten back by their conservative legislatures. So New Orleans passed the law, and then it was preempted by the state. In New York, our tenant advocates of the 1970s passed through a state law, which essentially informs the way our rent stabilization is shaped now. Yeah, so it was passed in 1974. It was weaker than the older rent control system, but nonetheless it still existed, and it covered New York and the suburbs, as Sam mentioned a little earlier. 1980s, we saw a pretty big conservative backlash against all sorts of progressive local laws and progressive organizing, both from the federal government, but also from local elected officials and local, basically legislatures on the local level as well. Rent control was blamed for all sorts of things, including declining conditions, homelessness, street crime, that really had nothing to do with rent control, but had everything to do with federal housing cuts and the shredding of the social safety net, mirroring perhaps what we're seeing now. During this time, about 35 states passed laws that preempted rent control. As Nada mentioned in her setup before this presentation, lots of states still have these laws on the books. The majority of the US, you can't pass a local rent control legislation until you get rid of the preemption on the state level. In places like New York and California that passed their laws in the 70s, it was much more difficult to just preempt the law, just because people tend to like rent stabilization, and it's difficult to get rid of something that already exists. But in New York, and again, a parallel move in California, the conservative state legislatures were able to insert all sorts of loopholes into these laws. And these included things like vacancy decontrol, where if a tenant moves, the apartment either gets a bonus in the amount of rent that the landlord could charge, or it resets to whatever the market level is, all sorts of pass-through fees that are factored into the rent because of improvements to the apartment or improvements to the building. So basically, all sorts of loopholes that weaken the law. At the same time, so this is the 1980s, we have an extremely conservative Supreme Court, and rent control again survives another Supreme Court challenge. In 1986, there's a local apartment association, and I think it's Berkeley, somewhere in California, sues the city to say that to prove that rent control is a form of a taking, and they're beaten back. And again, rent control is said to be constitutional. So like I said, in New York City, we see all sorts of different loopholes that are added to our to our rent control legislation. So when you go from the 1980s into the 1990s and 2000s, the city begins gentrifying, mirroring the kind of change that we're seeing in all sorts of cities at this time in the US. And the weekend rent regulation system really sets up the opportunity for the gentrification that happens and the speculation that happens in the housing market. Because landlords are able to hike up rents more quickly than they would have been if rent control didn't have loopholes that allowed apartments to turn over quickly and for rents to go up. Basically, landlords are able to speculate in those properties and over leverage them more quickly. And during this period, we lose about 300,000 rent-controlled units to deregulation. During this whole time, so from the early 1990s until now, there is organizing happening in New York City to strengthen the rent laws and to expand them as well. So both to get rid of the loopholes that were added, but also to expand the coverage of the law. In 2017, tenant groups launch something called Housing Justice for All, which is a coalition of about 80 groups all across the city and then all across New York State as well, who fight to strengthen rent stabilization. And there's a bunch of overlapping strategies that they use pretty successfully, including power building on a very, very small level. So organizing on the building level, launching a very effective narrative campaign. 2017, we have Trump in office for the first time. We have a governor who is holding back a bunch of progressive legislation by creating an environment where the Republicans control the legislature, even though they're not in office. It's a complicated thing that happens in our state capital, unfortunately. So they launch an effective narrative campaign to kind of bring this all to light and to push through progressive legislation and electoral work as well. So holding Democratic electeds accountable for not responding to tenants' needs. And this campaign is successful. So in 2019, we passed something called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, HSTPA, which really expands rent stabilization in New York. So it creates the potential for statewide coverage. So even though at this moment in time, we haven't seen as much of an expansion of the law as we would have liked because of landlord pushback, essentially, there is potential for all localities in the state to opt in. Before it was just New York and the 3 suburban counties. We get rid of vacancy decontrol, which is a huge deal. So landlords no longer get a bonus when an apartment flips over, and units are no longer able to be permanently deregulated as well. The amount that landlords are able to pass through to tenants because of the repair work that they do or pretend to do in their apartments or on their buildings is limited, and there are benefits to not just rent stabilized tenants in this law as well. There were limits on court fees and extended timelines for evictions for people to be able to come up with the money or look for alternative places to live. And also some benefits for manufactured home communities as well. There are manufactured home communities in North County, so in more rural parts of the state and on Long Island as well. So there's stuff that benefited tenants and residents there as well, including limits on lot fees and a creation of a type of right to purchase for tenants in manufactured homes. So law passes in 2019, the pandemic starts like 6 months later, and there are all sorts of political shifts that happen and economic shifts in the city. So it takes another 5 years for us to win good cause. Initially, good cause was part of the package of bills that accompanied what became the HSTPA, and because of the shift in political terrain, it took a while for this to pass, and the fight was much harder. Eventually, we got a good cause in 2020. Good cause passed in 2024 and created limits on unconscionable rent increases and lease non-renewals in New York City automatically, and an opt-in option for localities all across New York State. Unfortunately, The law also had significant carve-outs by portfolio size. There are a couple of carve-outs for expensive high rent apartments as well. And while our initial bill didn't have those things, this was kind of like a negotiation that happened because of a weaker position that we found ourselves in because of where we were in 2024 compared to where we were in 2019. So in New York, where we are now is we have good cause opt-in campaigns happening all across the state. I think by this point there's been 14 or 15 localities that have opted in. Those have been going been organizing pretty successfully. The law just passed about a year ago, and we're in a good place. The opt-ins into rent stabilization have been more difficult just because landlords have been able to weaponize a technicality in the 1974 law to basically sue localities that pass the opt-in, HSTPA opt-in, to slow the process down. And that is part of the reason where we're working on something called the REST Act, which would essentially redefine the way that rent stabilization works in New York State and allow for a broader definition of what a city has to do in order to, or a locality has to do to opt in, and to cover more types of buildings as well. In addition to that, we have our rent stabilization system has a rent guidelines boards. So there are campaigns around increases every single year. We're in the midst of one in New York City right now. Kind of finding ourselves in the same place as everyone else, where we're on the defensive against the federal regime that is hostile, again, to regulatory, all sorts of regulatory institutional power, and to tenants as well. Yeah, so that is kind of where we are, continuing with local fights, but also keeping our eye out on what's coming from the federal government. So I'm gonna end there. If you have questions for us immediately, you could put them into the Q&A box, or if you come up with questions later, please feel free to email us. And I'm gonna hand it over back to Neda.
Yeah, thanks so much, Oksana and Samuel, for presenting today and for providing that overview of rent stabilization. It really is a testament to how these protections work in tandem. So we will save our Q&A until the end, but I think there are some questions that popped up if you all wanted to take a look at them. But now I will pass it over to Kim McCarty, who's joining us from the Community Alliance of Tenants in Oregon, to talk about efforts to pass rent stabilization at the state level. So Kim, thank you so much for joining us, and I will pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm Kim McCarty, Executive Director for the Community Alliance of Tenants. And I'm also speaking in capacity of a member of what's called the Stable Homes for Oregon Families. This was the coalition that was able to help us get rent stabilization passed in Oregon. So go ahead to the next slide. And you can see here, it was, a big group. This picture goes back to 2019 when we first won the first elements of rent stabilization in Oregon. Go to the next slide. And then we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So rent stabilization in Oregon was called Senate Bill 608. As was pointed out, Oregon is one of those states where local rent control was preempted. So for many of us working on issues of destabilized housing, we were kind of butting our heads against the wall, like what can we do here? Huge numbers of communities had been destabilized. We had seen condo conversions. Rent in Oregon at that time could increase to any amount. So we were seeing, 30, 50% rent increases. and this was leading to huge destabilization. So we, of course, were dealing with legislators who held really negative narratives about people in poverty. Oregon is one of those states where legislators are not paid much. So it's really important that they have a second source of income to be a legislator, and it's incredibly common for a legislator to also be a landlord. There's also narratives about, the mom and pop landlords, not recognizing how the majority of landlords, this is a very commercial, very profit-oriented enterprise. They were dealing with the history about, the affordable housing market, believing that it was still affordable in Oregon. And then another thing that we were dealing with in regards to this proposal was that we had really good champions in the House, but not in the Senate. So that was very difficult. And as I pointed out, many of our moderate Democrats were also landlords. Go move on. So with those types of challenges, here's I wanted to explain a bit about how did we win. Well, first, it helped that in our largest city, the city of Portland, where rents were going up and causing this really visible destabilization, they found a workaround. So they created what's called a relocation assistance program. They said that, if rent exceeded 10%, then that household would need to be offered the option of some amount of money based on the bedroom size is how it's done there. So 1,000, I think it's up to about 5,000, depending on the number of bedrooms. This helped reduce the number of no-cause evictions, this policy, and it also sort of created the stepping stone for creating a statewide policy. Community Alliance of Tenants, I should have said some more about us. We are a community-based organization that's been around in Oregon for almost 30 years. We started off as volunteers of tenants, trying to educate our fellow tenants about what their rights were to keep people housed. And over time, we've become a nonprofit organization. We serve tenants throughout the state, largely in our metro areas. And we recognized about 10 years ago how bad it was getting, like how whole communities that had been in place as either as owners or as tenants were being completely displaced, 30 miles away to another city. And we said that we declared it as the tenant state of emergency. That was a really powerful moment because what it did was, one, clarify that there was a problem that needed to be addressed, and it also gave a number of our jurisdictions some leverage in terms of using their emergency powers to address the situation. And I think I lost everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So part of this strategy included the media, included the press, to put some pressure on these legislators. It was very important that we had a really broad coalition. So this included our tenant advocacy groups, like Springfield Eugene Tenant Association, Community Alliance of Tenants, the Oregon Law Center, Urban League, among many, and really importantly, it included our unions like SEIU and AFSCME. And we shared a lot of data and stories about the impact of the cost of housing on families, and that was very compelling. Yeah, I don't really see that. Next slide, please. So you can see how big this coalition is, and even these organizations, the logos you see here, also represent additional coalitions, and not just on housing issues, poverty, social services, a really broad range. So these groups represent Stable Homes for Oregon Families. They included issue experts and organizers. And people who could talk about, with authority about the impacts of no-cause evictions and rent increases and the impacts on our most vulnerable communities. We also came to the table with legal expertise, and then the political expertise. So knowing who to target, knowing that our unions had a lot of political capital, that they could utilize their phone banks and their relationships and reach out to their own members. Go to the next slide. We wanted to share how important it was in a coalition setting. Of course, we didn't come all to the table with the same expectations, and as many of you know, in a legal process, sometimes it's very disappointing, the types of compromises that need to be made. So initially, we were kind of faltering as a group. And we knew that we needed to agree on a bottom line, something that didn't deviate from our most fundamental values. And when we did that, that made us more successful. It helped us set expectations, it helped us be clear and more consistent. Also helped us identify people who really understood the policies and who could flag, what the trade-offs would be, and what would be, so to speak, the poison pill. And so trust and the open and honest communication was really critical to this success, and critical to this day for us to keep moving forward and making improvements to these policies. The next slide. Next slide, please. So to do that, it required what we called, an inside strategy, really understanding who was supporting us and who wasn't, and doing that vote counting, and then an outside strategy, and that was galvanizing the community, getting them there to testify, talking to the press. And so that inside outside campaign was especially important, and it also really helped to have our C4 partners, like the unions. And next slide. Let's go to the next slide, please. So to give you an example of how critical that inside-outside strategy was, this is one of the key legislators who was blocking this opportunity to pass this bill. And so, folks went to his door. There was a lot of press and targeting of this particular legislator, who eventually, Rod Monroe, who eventually did step down. And since then, there has been a tremendous also movement just politically in Portland as a whole, where we have more progressive legislators stepping up in all facets of government. And I think this was one of the turning points in that happening. The next slide. So as I said, SEIU was really instrumental to the passage of this rent stabilization law. It was a moderate Democrat that lost their seat in favor of a tenant advocate lawyer who was campaigning on the issue. And then at that point, that's when we had both the House and the Senate. And we also had some really powerful I guess, champions that wanted to elevate even further, and the speaker, and who eventually became the governor. So that was also extremely influential in that process. Next slide. So we did get it passed, and the coalitions and sort of the political elements at the time are what made that possible. It's been in place since 2019. And so one of the questions we have now is it working? And if not, why? So one of the reasons is that, yes, now we have no cause notices cannot be used to manipulate and harass tenants and to similarly displace people. We're protected now for most households from extreme rent spikes that cannot be used as, the functional equivalent of a no cause eviction. And the rent increases have been moderated over time. But we're not at a place in Oregon where rent is going up like 2 or 3%, which would be the normal sort of rate of inflation in keeping with wages. Instead, rents are going up about 10% a year. So even a low-income household that is still effectively being priced out in Oregon when you consider large rent increases, like up to 10% every year in just 3 years. That's a 30% rent increase, and over time it's even more severe. And there's still some very major loopholes in our legislation. We did have to concede to an exemption for new construction, and that exemption allowed new construction to not be subject to rent stabilization if it was younger than 15 years. And so that's the equivalent of about 40,000 households in Oregon that are not protected in any way from rent spikes. And we tried to reduce that loophole to 7 years just this year, and that was not successful. And largely it wasn't successful because of the larger market forces in housing. In Oregon, interestingly, we're seeing the highest rates of eviction, even higher than during COVID when there was so much widespread job loss. And we're also seeing high cost of housing, both home ownership and rental housing. And at the same time, we're seeing a slight decrease, but it seems very significant when you look at housing production. So housing production was going up. There were a lot of profits being made. In the last year or two, housing production has gone down. And so that has been the reason why folks, moderate Democrats, are saying no to rent stabilization, no to reducing the exemption for more households, because they think it's putting a chill on new housing production. And it's true. I mean, new housing production we're decades behind what we need, especially in affordable housing. But we believe that rent stabilization is not the cause of that decline. And in fact, it might be some perverse factors like intentional scarcity to drive up the cost of housing, but we're not entirely sure why. And for this session, we've been working to reduce like I said, the new construction exemption and some other tenant protections. Next slide. So in Oregon, we do have rent stabilization. We are working still to remove the statewide preemption. Portland has a local ordinance, relocation ordinance, and they are working to improve that as well. We also are working on some issues related to price fixing. Some of you have noticed that nationally, some of these property management companies have been accused, and the evidence seems to be there that they are engaged in price fixing. And we've also been working to regulate manufactured park homes to make sure that we can actually put a rent stabilization in that's even lower than what's in place for current apartments. And the barriers, as I pointed out, are fear that rent stabilization will pull a chill on construction, and that low-income tenants will be worse off than they were earlier. So thank you so much for this time to give you just a brief history of how we got rent stabilization passed in Oregon, and happy to take questions later this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Kim, for talking about efforts in Oregon to pass rent stabilization. Now I will pass it over to our final presentation of the day. Eden Aaron and Alex Vazquez are joining us from CASA in Maryland to talk about efforts to pass rent stabilization in Prince George's County. So thanks for joining us, and I will pass it over to you both. And we will be advancing the slides. Tara will be pulling that up. So just one moment, but Eden and Alex, I'll pass it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eden Aaron. I'm a Community Alliance of CASA, and I'm here today with my colleague Alex Vazquez, who is CASA's Director of Organizing, to discuss CASA's multi-year campaigns to secure rent stabilization in Prince George and Montgomery counties. This has been one of the most impactful housing justice movements in Maryland in recent years, and it all started in neighborhoods and apartment hallways and years of tenant organizing. Next slide, please. Yeah, so a little bit about CASA. CASA is a national organization with over 173,000 lifetime members across 46 states. But our CASA roots are deeply local. Our members are working class, Black and Brown, and immigrant families. CASA blends power building, human services, community organizing, and advocacy in order to improve the quality of life in Black and Brown and immigrant families. And next slide, please. And as a member-led organization, at CASA, our members vote on our priority advocacy campaigns. Our team of organizers, they work closely with our CASA members, committees to identify key policy areas where they know that change would impact their quality of life. So our advocacy campaigns, whether it be for housing, immigration, or healthcare, are chosen by our members and driven by their lived experience and the issues that they face. Next slide, please. Yeah, so when we talk about rent stabilization, we first have to talk about the need in Prince George and Montgomery counties. Just a little bit of number, more than 60,000 of our CASA members call Prince George and Montgomery County home. And CASA has been organizing in those two counties for decades. Well before the COVID-19 pandemic, our members were demanding tenant protections. But during the pandemic, those problems got worse. Our housing justice work had to escalate as we called for canceling rent, strengthening eviction protection, and halting rent increases at every level of government. Our efforts on the ground were successful. We were able to get emergency measures that were adopted in Montgomery County. We had a Renter Relief Act that capped rent increases at 2.6%. And in Prince George's County, there were temporary protections against terminations of leases and also rent hikes. Next slide, please. But after the pandemic protections ended, rents skyrocketed well above how they were before the pandemic. Rents jumped by as much as 56%. Some families saw increases of $500 to $800 per month. Over 50% of renters in both counties were already cost burdened, meaning they spent more than 30% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. And the wages in both counties just weren't keeping up. And it wasn't just about rent. Tenants were dealing with unsafe and horrible living conditions. Next slide, please. So there were rats, mold, broken heating, and more. And they couldn't afford to leave. And when renters tried to assert their rights, there was a lot of retaliation from landlords. And Black and Brown communities were mostly impacted by this, who are the majority of renters in Prince George and Montgomery counties. It also affected vulnerable populations such as seniors and school-aged children. Seniors make up almost 22% of Prince George County residents. And for many senior renters who live on fixed incomes, even a small rent increase meant making the choice between paying for rent or medication or groceries. We heard from seniors who are facing 300, 500, even 800 rent increases with no warning. It was forcing them to leave their communities that they built and lived in for decades. And also for school-aged children whose housing instability disrupts their education, it was very difficult. When their parents were priced out of their homes, those children were being forced to change schools, often multiple times in a year, which was creating educational setbacks and emotional stress and overall loss of social support that they needed. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is our members, young members, during one of the rent strikes that we held. Next slide, please. So we talk about the rent stabilization CASA campaign. I would say what made our CASA campaigns effective was that it has always been tenant focused and tenant led. From day one, we didn't just speak on behalf of renters, we organized with them. Tenants shaped the goals and the messaging and the demands of our campaigns. We built power from the ground by knocking on thousands of doors. We were holding multilingual tenant meetings in English and Spanish and French, so we can organize and get all members of the community. And we were creating spaces where renters could share their stories with lawmakers. Next slide, please. This is one of our coalition meeting to discuss our campaigns. And I will pass it to my colleague, Alex Vazquez, to run us through the rest of the slides.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aiden, for that explanation. And hey, everyone, good afternoon. I try to be brief because I know I'm standing in between the end of the presentation, which is a dangerous place to be since people are getting antsy. But just for the record, my name is Alex. I'm the director of organizing for the CASA organization. I oversee all of our Maryland organizing efforts and also at the national level. So, you know, essentially we're coming out of this pandemic era crises where we are seeing a lot of different protections that were put into place because, you know, a lot of folks were losing their jobs, right? They could not make ends meet with rent. If you're not familiar with the Montgomery County and Prince George's County and where they sit geographically, they're the two counties that surround the majority of Washington, D.C. So if you ever take a look at the map or have ever been to D.C. before, essentially those are the suburbs of Washington, D.C. We have a lot of federal workers that work in those two counties and that live in those two counties, but essentially a lot of working class families as well. After the pandemic, we had an opportunity in both counties, both Montgomery County and Prince George's County, that represent a little over 2 million people, with nearly, I believe, 800,000, if not 900,000 now renters between both of those counties. And we saw an opportunity to continue temporary protections that had a low cap of 3%. For the majority of the time after the moratorium and those initial protections during COVID were lifted. However, we knew that in order for us to be successful and more so stabilize a lot of families and renters in that area, we had to make this an election issue by making rent stabilization the issue. And so as temporary rent protections began to expire, a lot of organizations, including CASA, who have a C4 branch, right? CASA in Action, our sister organization that's morally involved in electoral politics, saw an opportunity to push for permanent rent stabilization legislation by uplifting the need of renters in both of those counties, but also ensuring that people who were considering to run for office, right, at the local levels, especially as for county council local races, right, that they really took into consideration the needs of renters and that the renters really needed and wanted a permanent protection status. So we started organizing. We started organizing local organizations, unions, faith communities, essential workers, federal workers. And throughout the months leading up to the election, there was a lot of opportunity for these potential local officials who were running for re-election or running for election to be able to interact and have town halls that came face-to-face with renters. It is also important to note that during this time period, both Montgomery County and Prince George's County were expanding from 9 council members to 11 council members in both jurisdictions, giving an opportunity to not only create more districts, representation matters, so creating more diverse districts, but also putting, once again, some potential progressive candidates that did support rent stabilization. Next slide, please. Obviously, with every campaign, we received pushback. And we were prepared, right? Both in Montgomery and Prince George's County developed a strategic plan to advance rent stabilization protection. And that meant really having to create power, not just amongst renters, but also with coalition spaces, right? As some of the other panelists described, right? You had essential workers, you had unions, excuse me, you had educators, small landlords, right? And we really needed an all hands on deck approach to ensure that both coalitions had anywhere from 40 and upwards to 70 different groups and organizations supporting this and really putting their weight behind this campaign. Just like other states that we're seeing, right? Lobbyists and the landlord lobby spent millions of dollars in both Montgomery County and in Prince George's County to ensure that this did not pass, specifically starting with Montgomery County, because up until that period, right, no county in the state of Maryland had ever passed a permanent protection measure. There are local municipalities in Montgomery County and also in Prince George's County that did have the opportunity, because of the way the Constitution is set up in Maryland, to pass their own form of permanent rent stabilization, an infamous municipality, Tacoma Park out of Montgomery County. But up until that period, no county had passed. And so they really put their efforts all in on Montgomery County to ensure, hopefully, that it did not pass, because they know that once Montgomery County passes something, there's a ripple effect, and that most likely the neighboring counties, such as Prince George's County and Howard County, were going to be followed afterwards. So it also became pretty apparent, right, that no moderate elected official wanted to be on record, including some of our most conservative elected officials, opposing the growing concerns of multiple communities regarding rent increases. And so I think that was a pretty good setup to what I call a double-edged sword effect, where you had everyone who was in an alignment with, yes, we do have rent increases, yes, something needs to be done, but it also set up 2 competing bills for both counties that created some additional obstacles. Next slide, please. So, so this is actually a photo of one of the photo of the Prince George's County Council building, right, where CASA members and renters were in front advocating for, I believe, canceling the rent hikes, right, during that time period. And as I mentioned before, in both jurisdictions, because the issue was so prominent and there was so much power behind it with renters, it created 2 pieces of legislation for each county, right? So in Montgomery County, we had a bill that was sort of labeled like the People's Bill. It was called officially the Home Act, which had a lower percentage of 3% or the CPI-U, whichever is lowest. And then there was a more developer-friendly bill that was at 8% starting plus CPI with no cap. Similarly, in Prince George's County, right, we did have a similar bill where there was 2 bill options. One bill that was a little stronger with a lower cap, right, and another bill that had a higher cap with CPI, a little bit more developer friendly. Next slide, please. So out of this came a merge of essentially one bill for each county, right? So how do we merge a bill that's really, really strong and has strong protections and a bill that's, you know, more developer friendly, right? Out of this sort of came a compromise bill in both jurisdictions, right? So in Prince George's County, we passed Council Bill 55, right? Which said that that there was a base of 3% plus CPIU with a cap of 6, right? The cap of 6 is probably the most important part, but it also included, partial vacancy control, a lower cap for senior housing, prohibited new fees, which we're hoping to include, and obviously increase for fines for landlords who violate the law. For this particular one, we weren't able to obtain a strong new construction or rolling new construction. So any building after 2000 is considered exempt from this rent stabilization. But there was just a special election with a new county executive and also a new council member joining on board. And one of the biggest things that we're looking to tackle is how do we lower the rate even more, but also ensure that there's more people that can benefit from this protection. Next slide, please. In Montgomery County, similar bill, right? In 2023, Bill 1523 was introduced, right? And it eventually passed in the June of that year. Montgomery County, once again, became the first county in the state of Maryland to pass a permanent measure. This bill is similar to the Prince George's County bill. This bill actually passed first, so a lot of the elements from the Prince George's County bill, the neighboring county, were derived from this particular bill. Once again, similar elements to that, right? Partial vacancy control. A lot of the components of a good and decent rent stabilization bill were added. We're hoping to revisit some of these components in a year. And of course, we had a new exemption for new construction with a 23-year rolling basis. Next slide, please. Another picture of folks testifying before the county council. Next slide, please. So once again, right, this actually really created a lot of conflict and strategic negotiation. The introduction of competing bills created a lot of drama between not only just the political environment, but also tensions amongst the coalition members, because you know, like any coalition, you have members that want a really, really strong bill and are really wanting to go above and beyond, right, to ensure that we do not stray away from that particular piece of legislation introduced, right? And then you had folks that are like, you know, on the other side, willing to negotiate. Despite those challenges, right, we remained united, just like some of the other panelists had mentioned with their campaigns, and a compromise bill emerged that closely aligned with the demands of renters, right, which is the most important part, accommodating some concerns, you know, from the other side as well. So again, now we have essentially two of the largest counties in Maryland outside of DC protected under the suit, and we're hoping to expand it to other counties in central Maryland and hopefully making its way up towards the Baltimore region. Next slide, please. So where do we go from there, right? We're continuing to fight for lower rent caps, right? We're continuing to fight and organize to ensure that we are fixing elements that we were not able to win from the first two county-wide rent stabilization policies in place. There's a lot of data that's being collected with the implementation process, especially in Montgomery County. A lot of data that actually is hard to get unless you start actually tracking it. And so that was actually one of the beautiful elements and components of actually passing a permanent rent stabilization bill in Montgomery County, because we were able to actually dedicate an entire department, a new rent stabilization department, to not only enforce, but also ensure that we are collecting valuable information that could be used not only for our jurisdictions, but hopefully for your jurisdictions as well, to see what works and what doesn't work when it comes to rent stabilization. It's estimated that right now, with the two current protections, we have a little bit of, I think it was like 130,000 units that are covered in both counties, right? And so we're expecting that number to grow as we amend some of the components of these policies and as the rolling dates, at least in Montgomery County, continue to move on up. Next slide, please. And so I think this is, next slide, please. This is a group from some of our members. I think that's it, right? Gotcha. So yeah, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to present. And if you have any questions, please drop it in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alex and Eden, for presenting. So we have a couple of questions in the chat and just a little bit left on this webinar. So thanks everyone for sticking with us throughout this long webinar. But this question, I think, is for everyone joining us today. Can you talk about some of the common pitfalls and challenges that tenants face when asserting their rights and how they can be overcome?
I can start with the basic one, which is just that our enforcement agencies are underfunded and understaffed. So a lot of tenants who have a legal right to a rent rollback or to some other action put in an application, and then it takes usually not months, but years for it to actually be adjudicated. And if they've been overpaying in rent and all that time, some of them might not have been able to afford that overpayment. So we kind of have to fight a parallel fight on enforcement of these laws, even as we're strengthening, and a constant budget fight to keep the agencies staffed.
And I'll just share one of the common things we see when tenants assert their rights is that usually there is retaliation, which can either result in tenant being evicted or having their services disrupted, or this could lead to informal eviction. So one of the common ways to overcome this is by passing just cause protections, passing the number of protections available to tenants. We know that tenant protections are stronger when they're passed together, but just ensuring that renters have rights to fight back against this retaliation, especially when they assert their rights during their lease term. I'll leave it if anyone else wants to answer this question, but there is a question, Alex and Eden, in the chat about how CASA was able to convince tenants to go on a rent strike. Can you talk about some of your messaging around this?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things to this. One, I think we live in a state where, especially in Prince George's County and Montgomery County, where we do have partnership with the housing authority, right? And so I think that that's always good. It's a little bit more tenant friendly, right? There were some communities, honestly, where we don't have good calls yet in Maryland. We fought hard to try to get it across the finish line, but unfortunately we were not able to get it across the finish line. But you'd be surprised that there's a lot of power when it comes to unity in organizing renters, especially when it comes to conditions-based. And because we do have resources to also represent individuals or tenants in court, right? We were able to have a safety net of protection against potential retaliation, but also use a rent escrow system, right? To uplift, saying that, like, because of these conditions, right, that have been identified so badly, right? You know, we can either go on rent strike or use that system in court. The last thing I will say is we just recently passed 2 years ago something called the Tenant Safety Act. I think another panelist mentioned that they were able to pass something similar in their state. The Tenant Safety Act allows essentially a group of impacted tenants to collectively use a rent escrow system to sue their landlord based on conditions. And so because of that passage, right, we have also been able to utilize that as a way to build power when it comes to rent strikes, and hopefully have a safety net so that people don't get retaliated against.
Thanks for that. And then we have another question in the chat. I'll open this up to all of our panelists, but the question about just cause not being able to be passed, and I know this webinar is about rent stabilization, but are there any messaging tips or words of advice you can offer to localities or states looking to pass tenant protections, especially when the fight for these laws is not listening to the people?
Kim, I think some of the messaging that made just cause more acceptable in Oregon was because we were in COVID, because the public could see the how it was damaging to everyone if people were displaced or evicted or made homeless, and so we also made the argument that that if people had more time, to resolve an issue, then they could become more stable and stay in their housing, and you should have a reason to evict someone. And every time we've done polling, everyone is in agreement with that. It just, that sort of basic fairness seems to resonate with everyone.
Yeah, and Kim, while you're unmuted, can you speak more about declaring a tenant state of emergency in Oregon?
We're community-based organization, run by tenants, tenant board, and so I think it was really powerful that messaging came from the community, came from tenants saying, we are so we just don't know what else to do except to just say this is truly an emergency, and by declaring that, it resonated with a lot of people and policymakers. And then I'll just add that we plan to do that again in some fashion this year. It'll be the 10-year anniversary of that declaration, and market conditions are very different, but we just want to uplift that this declaration was made. Here's the progress that we've made since then. Here's all the ways that we've gone backward since then, and so what is the new path forward? Because many of the changes that all of us have made, we know are not enough. And then just biting at the edges of these policies, it's been very incremental over the last 10 years, has been helpful, but it certainly doesn't address the depth of the issue. So we'll be declaring another state of emergency in a few months.
Thanks for sharing. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I do want to ask one final question that came up in the chat. But in the meantime, I do want to ask if our panelists feel comfortable putting their information in the chat so that if anyone has a question that didn't get answered, they can reach out. But the question I see is, what are some loopholes to look for or try to avoid when advocating for rent stabilization protections? And I think we can open this up to any of our panelists today.
I can start. So is the question, what kind of concessions should organizers avoid making? Is that the nature of the question?
Yeah, or I guess exemptions or ways that landlords have been able to get around these laws.
Yeah, I would say that arguing and organizing for vacancy control, so making sure that rents aren't reset at the point that an apartment flips over, so one tenant leaves or is displaced and another tenant moves in, because that really undermines the way that rent stabilization works. And additionally, what we found in New York, so we had partial vacancy decontrol between 1994 and 2019. And during that time, we lost a ton of apartments, so about 300,000 that were deregulated. There were a bunch of different loopholes that were kind of working together to make that happen. But one of the main ones was something called the vacancy bonus, where a tenant would, if a landlord was able to push a tenant out, or if a tenant left, the rent would go up by 20%. So that creates this environment where it is advantageous for a landlord to keep on trying to churn apartments and to bring in new tenants. And if you have tenants who are vulnerable in any kind of way, it puts a ton of pressure on them and creates a reason for landlord to try to get them out of the apartment. And because there's kind of like the unfair and unequal relationship that a single tenant has with their landlord, it is just a bad situation. Yeah, so I would say that that's one of the key things that we fought for in the expansion of the Rent Stabilization Act, and if you're drafting a new policy, making sure that you have vacancy control in place.
All right, thanks, Oksana. So we're right at time, and I don't want to hold anyone over, but I do want to thank our panelists again for joining us today and for sharing their experiences and their work with us. As mentioned, we have one final webinar on June 11th, and that will focus on code enforcement procedures and laws that strengthen habitability standards. But thank you all for joining us today and for spending your afternoon with us. Please feel free to reach out and we will see you all soon. Have a great day, everyone.